All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel's back again, Emancipations podcast. This time I'm sitting down with Nicolas Villarreal, who is a theorist for Cosmonaut magazine and is a Marxist, focuses on materialism. He focuses on economics, on state theory. He's an Althusserian. So welcome to the show, Nick. How are you?
Doing well, doing great. Glad to be on.
Yeah, it's really nice to have you on here. I mean, we started as sort of DMing in somewhat of a disagreement, but a comradely disagreement regarding the legacy of Louis Althusser, the great French Marxist. And you have written quite a lot about what we might call the contemporary relevance of Althusser. So that's one thing that I want to hear you talk about in this interview. But I think another big thing that Nick has written on, which on your Substack, and I'm going to put the link to this in the show notes, is where we are at with the contemporary theory of the petty bourgeois. You diagnose the contemporary American state apparatus and the kind of contradictory class oppression that it engenders in society as largely structured such that it is forced and forces itself, often unwillingly, by bureaucratic class, professional managerial class, to save the petty bourgeois, precisely because the petty bourgeois, and we can define, and I'd like to hear you maybe start by defining the petty bourgeois, are in a kind of liminal condition of crisis, kind of constant condition of crisis. They need to be bailed out. And part of the contradiction of the petty bourgeois is the fact that they hate the government, but they rely on the government. And ideologically, they formulate a politics which has a certain opposition to the interests of the working class, even though many of them hail from the working class, which I will say, Nico, is one interesting thing about the petty bourgeois from a Marxist point of view, which is the fact that precisely because their social existence is so acute and contradictory, they have a certain radicalism. That radicalism doesn't always go in a good socialistic direction, right? However, it could. Why couldn't it, right? What are the impediments to how might socialists begin to forge an alliance, or is that such an alliance not possible, and we have to construct the state as socialists in such a way where we I don't know, collectively disempower them, because you also show that historically in the 20th century, you really associate them with the rise of fascism, especially in Germany.
Yeah. And I would say Italy as well and elsewhere. But there's a couple things I would like to clear up first, because there's one of the things you were saying was that the state in like the bureaucrats, PMC, professional managerial class, one of the most important things, I think, in my understanding of the state is that the bureaucrats and the professionals are not a class. And this is, I've gone down this big rabbit hole when the new class debates were really a hot thing a few years ago. And this is like, if you take anything away from this, the most important thing that I feel like I've discovered in my research was when I started reading Samuel Huntington's The Soldier and the State through the lens of Althusser. Now, most people know Huntington for the Clash of Civilizations things, but his earliest work, the way he got started, was in civil-military relations. And his whole thing was looking at the history of professionalism and in the context of the military, and what brought that about, what it did, and what it was exactly. And Huntington described professionalism as this idea of a group, which is a corporate group, which is outside of society, separate from it, but which has a higher duty to it. And the way that this group is created was through liberal education. And this was the big innovation of the Prussian military and bureaucratic reforms after the Battle of Jena, a few years after that. And this is what really allowed like the modern liberal democratic state to exist. Because if you look at like the Marxist canon on the revolutions in France, look at the Second French Republic and then the Commune and the Third French Republic. What happens that causes like all of these big revolutionary explosions in like the most literal, minute like timeline of what happens? It's that the National Guards units that are sympathetic to the proletariat basically revolt. There's mutinies. The soldiers refuse to fire on the people of Paris, things like that. And what professionalism solved, and you can see this very directly with what was the reforms that happened in the Third French Republic, is that they adopted the Prussian-style liberal education for military officers and professionalism associated with that. And because they were afraid of both Bonapartist like retrenchment from the military, from generals, and also from proletarian kind of revolutions, mutinies, those type of things. And this was basically the solution to it. And this was adopted. This started to get adopted basically everywhere in the developed world after the Franco-Prussian War, basically. And now it is everywhere. It's every state that you can find that isn't like in a constant like civil war or falling apart has a professional military built along these lines. And so for me, professionals are defined by an ideology. And that's what I saw from looking at this from Althusser's angle, which is that it's not like Huntington takes professionalism to be like the real thing, like an actual object. But it is from Althusser's perspective an ideology in a sense that it is something produced by ideological state apparatuses and has this specific function to reproduce the relations of production.
So that's good because I mean I think that's congruent with Marx's original insight into professionals, which is that they're not a class, and so help us then define them. And I don't think that I mentioned that they're a class in my opening remarks. I said that the petty bourgeois is actually a pest to them, to their function, because in the bourgeois state, I think the Marxist and later the Leninist view and even the Althusserian view from the standpoint of class is that the bourgeois state has the task or grants itself the task to preserve the interests primarily of the bourgeoisie. Now, we can also say of the capitalist class, but I think then, the difference between bourgeois class and capitalist class is ultimately irrelevant because they're almost synonymous. And so in a certain way, the professionals also, right, in a socialist state would function as what Lenin calls a cadre. So it's not that Marxism is anti-professional. I think that's really important. But at the same time, Marxism, stretching back to what distinguishes it from Blanquism, always had thought of professionals in a more egalitarian and I would say less vertically hierarchical sense than the Blanquists, right? Because that was like the revolutionary left at Marx's time that Marx and Engels were very kind of critical of, right? Because they had this idea ultimately, in Blanquism, you know, ultimately the professional vanguard could does not need to house itself within the proletarian movement itself, right?
So what I would say is that what Marx and Engels probably understood professionalism to be is probably a little bit different from what we would consider it to be today. Because what really changed in like that time period right after Marx died, basically, was this rise of liberal education as we know it today. And this is something that was basically shared between the Western states and the Soviet Union and everywhere else. The only really exception, like there was only one real moment where this started to get wound back significantly. That was the Cultural Revolution. That they basically emptied the universities, which, like, even though higher education was basically destroyed, primary education in the countryside really expanded during that time, and they still to this day have better rural education than a lot of the surrounding Southeast Asian countries. So I would say that what they were basically talking about in terms of professionalization was just a standard specialization. And this is kind of what the French military was like before the reforms in the Third Republic, when they introduced liberal education. That they only had a technical education before that, and that I think is more like the technical specialization in this certain thing is kind of what they were thinking about at the time. So a little bit of a detour here because. But because we were going to connect this to the petty bourgeois. But I think it's very important because this is like what I describe in the article on the petty bourgeois is that basically this mechanism of professionals is a part of the state apparatus, basically as kind of like a digital computer versus like an analog parts that the states had before. Because professionals can be very versatile and do all sorts of different things, and they do it in like is a general deference to authority as like servants of society at large because of that ideological aspect, and because of this, like they were very important to pacifying all the various social classes. The two in particular, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And this occurred both in the Western capitalist countries and also in the Eastern Bloc. That there was, like, even though you could say that there was this ruling class, the relative autonomy of the state and these professionals, basically, they acted to suppress like the actual active rule, direct rule of their respective ruling classes in order to keep the system functioning smoothly.
That's very helpful because I know Adorno has this wonderful series of lectures on ideology, and that's actually where ideology comes from, like the class of what's called the ideologues after the Napoleonic government is established, and they perform a highly idealistic role in France insofar as, and I think what you're saying is very compelling and very interesting because it shows the power of professional ideology and state power. But could you say a little bit more about, because what you were saying sort of goes against what I was saying, that ultimately the professionals are beholden to furthering bourgeois interests. Is that true? Or how do you, because what you were just saying sort of went against that a little bit. Can you say more about that?
So it's, I think it's in line with what Althusser was originally saying, is that, and kind of what Lenin was saying, but not really, is that the relative autonomy of the state like means that they are basically ensuring the reproduction of the system, which is entails the dominant position of the bourgeoisie in society, in economics and all that, but it does directly preclude their direct rule as political rulers. Because what happened is when they tried that was the Second French Republic, and to a lesser extent the first, and it blew up in their faces. And they've never, there's been very few instances where they could have stable rule like that, because they are such a minority of society, and the great strength of bourgeois society was its ability to mobilize people in this kind of universalist way in the French Republic, the original Republican Wars, and then the Napoleonic Wars. But that was also a double-edged sword for it, because it made the military kind of a place of open political contestation for at least a moment before it was professionalized. And the professionalization basically was a means of pacifying those classes. Now, I say that in my essay that the petty bourgeoisie is basically the last one to be pacified, because they were more marginal, less important up until recently, except in the case of fascism, where things kind of just exploded outwardly.
So just so we're following the thread, your suggestion is that the professional class, through the use of
not class, just professionals.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. Well, that's okay. So you're right. No, I mean that distinction is essential, but it is curious. Then, what would be the incentive for the pacification? Right. So ultimately, their function is a pacifying function,
right,
to not allow the dominance at a kind of like superstructural level, ideological level in society. And this is where you could understand Althusser's notion of the repressive state apparatus. Perhaps would you mind elaborating on that, because that then gives a outsized role to the power of the bureaucrat, and I've always read that as a reflection of the distinct experience of Stalinism. Althusser is not the only one to write about the power of the bureaucrat, like Lacan and a lot of French theorists at that time were also writing about this, and they developed distinct theories to account for it, right? Like Lacan has this idea of what's called the university discourse to describe a particular perversion of bureaucratic knowledge, because bureaucratic knowledge initially had the premise of preserving the enactment of like the universalism of bourgeois civil society and its neutral furtherance, right?
Yeah, so a couple clarifications on Althusser's terminology is that for him, the repressive state apparatus was specifically talking about the military and the police and those type of things. And when he's talking about the ideological state apparatus, he's talking about a much broader thing than the state directly, even state bureaucrats, although it includes that. He's including the media, he's including unions and churches, and even the family. Basically, all of civil society, except for direct production, is included in the state ideological apparatus. And the reason he says that is because it has the specific function of socializing people into specific roles in bourgeois society. And it's what gets them to continue working and being obedient and accepting the authority of the state and its specific class relations of their society. So when so like what he's so I think with respect to professionals, like there is like that impact of Stalinism, but he is still kind of he's still talking specifically also about capitalism and liberal democracy when he's talking about those things. Although he is also using it as a way to kind of critique Stalinism and get people to not treat like the official line out of Moscow as like something substantive or scientific, because it is just a state ideology. Um, so that's how I would answer that.
That makes sense. I suppose my question then is, now pivoting to petit bourgeois, how, because one of the things I've always thought of here is that if the bourgeois state must enforce a sort of pacification of the class struggle, are you suggesting that, like, well, how does Althusser's theory then account for those mechanisms of enforcement? And then bring in, if you would, in your, as you articulated in your article, the danger of the petit bourgeois to the state apparatus. What is like the unique danger that they pose? I mean, we know, for example, in a way, they're kind of similar to the lumpen proletariat, insofar as neither of them have a direct relation to productive labor, and also neither of them are a part of the two primary classes in capitalist society, and they both tend to link up with reactionary ideological forces. Those reactionary ideological forces tend to also not be reflective of the professional ideologies. They tend to be in some kind of conflict with one another. And so it seems to me that if you look at Trumpism, for example, Trumpism would say that, yeah, the heart of repression today is the professional liberal woke mind virus, or whatever they call it, right? Which I don't even entertain these ideas, but that's what they would say. And they're saying that, could you give like an Althusserian account as to how that works? Now, of course, the repressive apparatus, I mean, I've never quite thought that category is too useful, because I think in a certain way, is it not true that this intra conflict here itself is the side of a very profound ideological and a series of antagonisms? I think the problem with those antagonisms for Marxists is that we kind of see them as partial or merely rhetorical or cultural or kind of symbolic, whereas a lot of people on the right perceive those contradictions as like extremely threatening to their social existence and stuff like that.
So
and
when you said repressive apparatus, you're actually talking about the ideological state apparatuses.
I'm saying that I see there's some ambiguity in the overlap between the two, precisely because the ideological state apparatus produces repression. And I think that this conflict that we have, this conflict that we see, right, in the field of ideological struggle, which again, I think for Marxists, and I wonder if you agree, often doesn't really elevate to something that interests us, because it's usually over, usually sometimes I think we perceive these ideological conflicts as superficial or as distractions from more serious antagonisms of the class struggle. I perceive them as marginal. For example, debates regarding, certain reproductive questions and how they get taken up in the media and all of that. That does lead to repression, censorship, etc. Does it not?
So what I would say is that I would kind of say that repression means something a little bit harsher than that in like Althusser's vocabulary, and it's more talking about like direct violence in controlling things. ideological, like the apparatuses, ideology is a form of social control for sure. It is a form of domination in that sense, and I don't want to undersell that. I just want to have something in reserve to talk about like the actual violence the state does. Um, I think that with respect to the petty bourgeois, the fact that like the states basically came up with a lot of different techniques for controlling the proletariat and also the bourgeoisie to a certain extent, and preventing the class conflict from spilling out too much. I mean, we're all familiar with stuff since the War on Terror is very obvious, spying, all kinds of police actions, SWAT teams, all that type of stuff. And then also there's the way that the media has evolved, which is very different from the media ecosystem that Marx and Engels would have had. That newspapers that would have been able to have these mass readerships that would have had all these different alternative views. Which it's interesting. Things are much more fractured now, but still quite difficult to have that sort of messaging disciplined and far-reaching nowadays. So the reason that the petty bourgeoisie is hard to pin down, like the state, like there is this kind of direct conflict between kind of MAGA and that professional ideology, and that, and it's the very traditionally Bonapartist way of conflict, but although it didn't really like that, like it's the problem is that the throughput there isn't professionalism so much, but kind of the connection between liberalism and intellectualism to a certain extent, because all of the one thing that all leaders of the Second French Republic had was that they were all some sort of intellectual, and that's why they were attracted to liberalism. You had Alex de Tocqueville, who actually served in Bonaparte's cabinet. You had Victor Hugo, the guy who wrote Les Miserables, people like that. And there's that throughput to the professionals now, because the professionals are created by liberal education. And what you can imagine, kind of like there is this sort of desperation, I think, to be able for conservatives to control that, and for the petty bourgeois don't like this stuff, because it's like they have this fantasy that they can get rid of all these things without it producing any problems for capitalism, because they need like the extra room of surplus that goes to the state to maintain security for themselves. Basically, they have much lower profit rates than higher bourgeois. They are much more precarious as a result. They're almost on the verge of proletarianization in many cases, and that terrifies them. So they hope, they want to get rid of that. They want to directly control these ideological effects. Is their fantasy, but
and they exaggerate. So they exaggerate the extent to which liberal enforcement of liberal values and sort of general professional values, they exaggerate that as more repressive than it perhaps is. But also, as many Marxist writers have noted, something interesting about the petty bourgeois is that a lot of their politics will naturally gravitate to populism, because they desire to work with a leader that can give special favors and circumvent the enforced neutrality of the market, so-called. which a lot of professionals would want to function to preserve that, at least at a formal level, right? Like, bourgeois legal rights. And so petty bourgeois leaders, and this I think is also connected to the fascism question, when they face collective crisis as a class, will want to summon forth an authoritarian populist figure to resolve their crisis, right, for them.
Sure. So, I think that it's. I mean, the problem is now is that society is so much more atomized than it was during the era that fascism took hold, and that the fascists were, for all their many horrors, they were still kind of communal in a sense. They were still like the sacking of Jewish homes was a big communal activity. The Nazi Party was a mass party. So the petty bourgeoisie is not like that today, because society isn't like that today. They're much more similar to the peasants of like the French Republic, early French republics that were totally atomized, and Marx talks about that. And that atomization is one of the big problems right now, and one of the reasons why they're having so much trouble to control the petty bourgeoisie right now. Because unlike every other class that had its power associated with like their collectivity, the petty bourgeoisie is kind of like also defined by their individual kind of little island of production that they control. And there's a whole American tradition of that. And this social atomization that has occurred is a big problem for liberal capitalism in general. And I think that the petty bourgeoisie is the class that is most poised to benefit from it. Because as I've written in an unpublished article critiquing Fukuyama, who talks about how all of the totalitarian countries were extremely atomized. People didn't have connections to each other or to the state because there weren't any mediating institutions. That situation is basically more and more what liberal capitalism is becoming. There's no mediating institutions. People don't have connections to each other. And this has basically destroyed a lot of the social control that was built because it was of that kind. It was about socializing people. This like the petty bourgeoisie is kind of like their bare bone socialization is the fundamental one of capitalism, of exchange, and their whole existence is just as nodes of exchange. So you can't unsocialize that. There's no way to do that, no matter how atomized you are, because it is just the most pure atomization. I approached this not from that angle. That's not why I thought the petty bourgeoisie, to me, was an empirical problem. It's like, obviously, this is what's going on right now. These are the people doing January 6th. This is an empirical phenomenon of politics that we're experiencing. And I wanted to explain that somehow. This is how I came into it.
It's very powerful. I mean, in a certain way, what you're talking about is like they're all like what Marx and the Grundrisse called like a Robinsonade. This concept, which would track, and that would make sense insofar as the small producer, as an island unto themselves, does not actually perceives social links or social bonds or connections to a collective purely in a negative way or as arbitrary or something like this. So that itself reflects a certain, you could say, almost like nuclear form of social violence. Now, the state itself is an engine of the perpetuation of violence, and you write a lot about that. And I wonder if you could say a bit about the function of violence in the state, because it seems to me there's like a weird connection between the sort of subjectivity of the petty bourgeois as atomized, but also as, yeah, as also as like a source where you would have extra parliamentary violence, where you would have, if they are like let's say we face a societal wide crisis, we could reasonably rely on the petty bourgeois to arm themselves, to be at the vanguard of promoting social violence to enforce and preserve their way of life, right? So in that sense, maybe it's not so much the lumpen proletariat that is the most dangerous class today, but as Marx said, right, but the petty bourgeois.
Right. Yeah, I think that I mean, part of like what he was talking about with the lumpen pro is just being able to pull all of these people into various gangs of thugs that you can use to beat up political movements and like people in the street, which there's really no need for that right now. And but so to talk about violence, I think that one of the fundamental things that Althusser kind of formulates, it's not in one of his pieces is most read because it's more recently published. It's in the Philosophy of the Encounter. There's his essay Marx and His Limits, that he gives this formulation basically of that the role of the state is the relative maximization of violence, which is to have more violence to provide a tool, to be a tool for the ruling class, which provides more violence than any other social actor in society can provide. And to have that edge over every other actor is basically the purpose of the state. So it's not like anything like a monopoly. It's just whoever has the most. And this is important because this provides a basis to think about like the social evolution of the state. Like Adorno has that quote about how there's there isn't like a straight like Whiggish history or whatever, but there's this line from a slingshot to the atom bomb or something like that. And this is basically what that logic of relative maximization is all about. And what the two halves of Althusser's idea of the state, the repressive apparatus, is basically like the state's own ability to commit violence. And then the ideological state apparatus, its purpose is to decrease the violence capabilities of every other actor in society.
That is so good. I mean, I love the framework of Althusser's theory of the state, and you compare it to Foucault's understanding of the state. And I think when you look closely at these two frameworks, I myself am much more convinced of Althusser's. And I would invite you to say a few things about Foucault's idea, because he develops this notion of governmentality. Mm-hmm. And it's the value of Foucault's theory of the state, as I see it, is this notion that he kind of helps us account for how a kind of multitude of like sub agencies function to further the objectives of the state. And so like he helps us think the logic of the interconnection of civil society groups to a fulfillment of the state. You also have like, the Marxist pre-Althusserian theory of the state, which in Lenin is mostly, I think, interesting because it's tied to a theory of one that is kind of teleological, if we're honest, like i.e. the theory that that it's a bourgeois state and that it has a primary function. Its primary function is the preservation of the exploitation of wage labor, and that the only means by which this oppressive form of the state can be overcome is through the enactment of an alternative to it that begins on the foundations, on the shell of its oppressive existence through a dictatorship of the proletariat and the active movement of overcoming it from within. And then you have that debate in post-Leninist thought as to what actually is the meaning that the state must wither? I really feel that this has not been answered, and there's so much confusion about this question. At some point, I'd like to ask you your opinion about that, because the way that I'm thinking about that these days is that it's like a socialist state in which the state withers really is a reference to the withering of a particular form of class oppression and domination that characterizes the bourgeois state. It's not like a pure, I don't know, maybe anarchistic idea of, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that's something we can talk about, but maybe could you say something also about Foucault's theory of the state as a comparison to Althusser?
So it's been a while since I've read Foucault, so I'm not sure I could do it justice. But my
the skinny, the overview, the basic overview is fine.
I think that the big advantage that Althusser's theory has over Foucault's and a lot of the post-structuralists is just that in general it is a straightforwardly materialist theory that is connected back directly to like the goal of like the whole point of having this relative maximization of violence is to continue to produce to reproduce the relations of production and production itself, and that's a very straightforward thing that I think gets lost in a lot of post-structuralism, and I critique Deleuze in that I think it was that Substack article for basically trying to turn the end of capitalism into this like apocalyptic kind of abstraction that doesn't actually refer to anything real, that we can think about that in much more concrete terms. In terms of like Lenin and stuff, I think that the big thing that is lost in the original Leninist formulation is that what like he says somewhere that when there is high periods of class conflict, that the state has more relative autonomy and can do things that aren't just like in the bourgeoisie's direct interest. But that kind of leaves open the question of like, okay, if there's this autonomy, what's the logic of it? Which isn't really answered in Lenin. And that's one thing that Althusser provides. In terms of, go ahead.
Sorry, so you're saying that Althusser supplements Lenin because he gives an account as to how the bourgeois state apparatus preserves its autonomy,
or like what is the content of its autonomy, like what drives it when it has that autonomy. And I also would say that, like, apart from Lenin, he does provide something of a, if not quite totally a more transhistorical theory of the state than what Lenin provides, which is totally focused on the bourgeois state.
Interesting. Yeah, that tracks. Yeah, that is very powerful. But in Althusser, how would you approach the question of the transformation of the state? Because sure. I think that that is the essential question for Marxism, and I myself am not confident that Althusser gives us a great answer there, but perhaps he does.
Well, I don't think he gives the answer directly. I think he gives us the tools to come to an answer. Because, I mean, he was still basically operating within the Communist Party's orthodoxy about those kind of questions. But if we look at what he's saying, the conclusions that I've come to is that, first, let me give what his actual answer is that we have all these, he comes up with all these ideas about the ideological state apparatus, the repressive apparatus, basically what the proletariat is doing is creating its own apparatus to overcome the bourgeois one, and destroy it and replace it. But I think what the experience of the Soviet Union has shown is that the professional state apparatus, the professional party apparatus, that basically, like, it wasn't the same, obviously, as the Western capitalist states, but it took most of the things it had from it. It was training up these professionals to run things in a certain way, pacified social classes, I talked about, but in doing so, and that was at the time the best methods of social control available. And that's the important thing, is that the logic of the state was that it always has to have that relative maximization of violence. And because there was no better alternative to the professional bureaucracy, that's what they had. And I think you kind of saw in the Cultural Revolution an attempt to move past that, but it didn't work out for obvious reasons. It couldn't do the thing that the state was supposed to do. It couldn't reproduce society. The production kind of collapsed more or less. It was too chaotic. It was kind of, the way I thought about it is, it was kind of like a nuclear bomb that went off, and a hydrogen bomb. And what we have to be thinking about, I think, is a way to have a stable fusion reaction, in a way to have a non-professional state emerge that is better at doing the things the state does than the professional state. Because that's the important
powerful
thing.
I think you're onto something here. And so let me kind of recapitulate, because you said a lot of very, very powerful things. The experiments in Russia and China in state-like communism still utilized the methods of social control vis-a-vis the state, which they basically inherited from the bourgeois tradition of the West, number one. Yes. And then number two, all of that is premised upon a certain power of the professionals, for which Althusser helps us very well think very well in these two general buckets of ideological and repressive. Although within the ideological, there's a lot of repression, let's just say.
Okay.
We'll agree on that. But or maybe a lot of pseudo-aggression or a lot of pseudo-repression. Maybe
a lot of social control. There's lots of domination.
There's lots of social control and domination. Fair enough. Okay. I'm with you so far. So the unfinished and the unthought question, right? Mm-hmm. Putting aside how we define smashing of the state, and because smashing of the state is how you move from socialism to communism in some ways. But what you're now suggesting, and I totally agree with you, seems to me to hinge upon, right, liberal education, right, and liberalism as a philosophy and ideology in a certain way, as a means by which the professionals acculturate themselves into becoming effective stewards of the state, right? Now, I asked you to look at Goran Terborn's work. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it. He's a Swedish Marxist who's written about this as well.
I got about halfway through.
Okay. So a couple thoughts from Terborn, and on the show here, we're going to be doing more work on Terborn, and including on this particular essay, because I think it's extremely useful. It's basically what he wants to suggest is that the Leninist cadre strategy becomes the best way to produce a non-professional state leadership structure. And instead of a system of liberal, so-called meritocratic hierarchy and ascension of the professional, not class, but of the professionals, instead of that, Terborn argues that there must be a selection process based upon a cadre who themselves are connected to the interests of labor as a distinct sphere. So you could think of the professionals, therefore, and like what the logic of their selection would be. And this I think is interesting. I wonder if you agree. Would be the extent to which they have proven to effectively forge alliances and solidarities with the interests of labor.
So
they're like organizers. So basically, the state bureaucratic figure becomes what Terborn calls an organizer. Mm-hmm. And then, therefore, their value to the system of the state is found in the degree to which they maintain an ideological line in support of the interests of labor.
So I would agree that was what they were basically doing in the social states, but it's also like they were still professionals who had a certain type of liberal education, and at least in most situations, there are certain times where it was that wasn't true. But the problem, I think there are deeper problems with that. However, I'm more sympathetic to the democratic republicanism kind of tendencies of neo-Trotskyism. I think that having the ban on factions, that kind of cadre is kind of the discipline is centered around.
You are a writer for Cosmonaut, after all.
Yes. Although I am also more of a fellow traveler than a proper cadre of their organization.
Same with me. I think we're similar in that way. Can you describe the ban on factions for the benefit of listeners and like a little bit more about that?
So in the Second International, before the Bolshevik Revolution, there were many factions within the were not then the communist parties, but social democratic parties, and even the Bolshevik Party itself was considered a social democratic party. But during the revolution, during the Civil War, they instituted a ban on factions in order to maintain the discipline necessary to basically run a military and win the war. And that was became a tradition basically that continued after the war, and was adopted by all of the Third International parties basically, and has been a staple of Marxist, Leninist, and Trotskyist parties ever since.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think I interrupted you slightly as you were describing or responding to my theory of how you would construct a professional, like let's call it like a socialist professional group or entity.
So I think we need to actually find a way to move beyond professionalism, basically. And that's not easy because it hasn't been done yet, because it's still like professional bureaucracies are still, as of today, the best way of running things, most efficient, most effective. But I think the point is to try and find new ways of social coordination and doing the functions of a state without professionals. And I think that if you had like a more cybernetic system of coordination that gave people the tools to learn all these different functions of society, how to do different things, how to make basically functions of the state and the economy transparent to people, and they would be capable of running things without. Because the problem, there is a big downside, practical downside to professional bureaucracies, which is that they are expensive, and they is like you can see in how states are today that they continually get bigger, they get more expensive. State spending is more and more of the economy, and it's not just the direct state, it's also all these NGOs, it's also all of these media apparatuses, all these different things, all this largesse in society that It's just basically for the ideological control. And if you can find a way to have a relatively stable society without that, it would just be more efficient.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I suppose then the question, in a way, goes back to violence, right? Insofar as, I mean, this is why I'm drawn to Koji and Karatani, because Karatani argues, in a very rigorous way, I think, that historical materialism has a sort of originary defect because its theory of revolution is founded upon a necessity of violence, right, as counterforce, and for him, it's quite deep. I won't get into everything, but it kind of goes back to his Kantianism, oddly enough, insofar as he thinks that Kant was correct to theorize an abolition of capitalism through what Kant referred to as associationism, and that associationism remains the horizon of also, like, what Marx realized after witnessing the Paris Commune, as a form of social existence that is capable of forging a solidarity around a kind of anti-capitalism. But when he says, when you have like standard historical materialist Engelsian Marxism that focuses all agitation at the side of production as the centrifugal node of revolution, Karatani says that this creates a countervailing violence, and he wants to avoid that. So he says that in reality, we must actually think socialist revolution at the side of exchange, and that's why he thinks that, like, the tactics necessary for socialist revolution are anti-consumerist and using boycotts and using other. So anyways, all of his praxis is a bit, we could say, maybe idiosyncratic, and I'm not sure that it's actually successful. But I think his fundamental point about violence is essential, right? So you would have to conceptualize this form, because part of what the rationale of the liberal professional is that the ideological state apparatus will also mitigate, the repressive one too, but it will also mitigate social violence, right? Of classes, of class struggle too. So how have you thought about that? And I know that's like a huge question, but maybe we can just kind of like speculate in general about this question: socialism and nonviolence, maybe.
Right. I mean, I think that, so in terms of political tactics within capitalism, I agree basically with the neo-Trotskyist kind of conception. I think the most important thing is trying to create a new civil society, basically in the here and now, because that was the basis of the whole Second International political parties. They weren't just political parties; they were all kinds of associations and clubs and media and unions associated with them. And that is totally missing from contemporary life. And part of the problem is, of course, as I talked about earlier, is that social atomization has continued apace, and people are much more not connected to each other. And finding a way to get around that is the big challenge of the present day, I think. And that is true no matter what kind of politics you have. I wrote this one blog talking about how I'm very optimistic about Blue Sky, the app. Well, not necessarily the app itself, but the protocol that's underneath it, which could allow for several different companies, groups hosting the services that are all connected to each other, and also, most importantly, allows people to maintain control of their social graph in cyberspace. And this is something that I hope could allow for the reemergence of the type of media ecology that was around in Marx and Engels' day. That's the goal, I think, is to recreate something like that.
That's very helpful. No, I mean, I think I'm convinced of that as well, and I suppose in a certain way, it still, however, does not answer the question regarding the functions and the task of the structure of the state that would avoid the need to implant a bureaucratic appendage, such as the professionals, to preserve the interests of the state.
Right.
So how would you do that? Because the interests of the state, in a Marxist sense, would be furthering the interests of the broader working class. And so one thing that Terborn says, and I wonder if you agree with this, is that you would have to sort of disable from within the sources, multiple sources of class oppression, and one of those is the distinction between intellectual and manual labor. And so that's one of his suggestions, is that leadership of the state would not, as it does in liberal bourgeois states, always be privileged to intellectual labor. Therefore, I mean, that's actually why, in an interesting way, a lot of people have said, well, why not use the lottery as a form of a selection process? Right. And in a certain sense, I'm actually very... Karatani, who I just mentioned, is an advocate of the lottery as a form of thinking. Because if you think about that for a second. A lottery for elected positions in society, if they were enacted and they were robust and they were not manipulated, the precondition for them to be functioning well would mean that universal education must itself be of a certain quality. That that itself would remediate class divisions and oppressions, right? So I think that's the imagination that would have to go into this. Is like every decision has to be from that kind of class lens to mitigate these otherwise, because that's the other thing that bothers me about professional liberal ideology, is that its ideological foundation is functions to obscure and provide alternative accounts of social conflict often than from what social conflict is really made up of. So perhaps I would wonder also if in an interim period, it would be necessary for socialist professionals to introduce forms of ideology that would be capable of, and this maybe goes to the civil society goal, but how are we going to help the broader working class begin to see social reality through a lens which is not overdetermined by hegemonic ideological state apparatus? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it does. I think that the number one thing, I think the number one thing we should do is actually quite similar to the Cultural Revolution, except without all the specific. We don't necessarily need struggle sessions or what have you. What we do need to do is eventually phase out the university system and replace it with a much higher quality primary education system that is universal. And the point of this is that the ideology of professionalism, as I mentioned before, is an ideology to create a group of people who see themselves as separate from society and subordinated to it. I think that the goal of this universal primary education that would replace it would necessarily be to create an ideology where people see themselves as leaders, basically, and of being able to participate in society, in the economic and political realm, in order to shape their collective destiny. And that is the most important thing there. Because without that, you get this fundamental passivity. You get and you need everyone to be fully bought into things, or else eventually, if you're not doing that, then you can get into a very precarious situation. If the cadre or socialist professionals or whatever have you have the same idea of trying to save society from itself, then eventually, when things don't work, nobody will believe in anything. Nobody will believe in the system at all.
And then you would be repeating the, let's say, like in historical hindsight, flawed direction of where Bolshevism went.
Yes.
So I can see that. However, where would you muster the resources required to contribute to a shift, which would I think have to be done, of the social reality superstructural cultural adoption of sort of socialist perspectives that would be capable of drumming up the democratic will, right, of the proletariat, right? Because the truth is the ideological state apparatuses and their internal battles and wars mostly result in kind of like various forms of irrationalisms or petty bourgeois individualisms, or some good things come from it, but most of it is meant to be a defense of the status quo. Mm-hmm. So where will the countervailing hegemony? You see what I'm saying? I agree with your vision long term that the university system is a central problem for the perpetuation of this issue, and that B, if we institute an alternative that is the same structure of like a socialist professional, we're going to be repeating the errors of 20th century state socialism. But yet still, nonetheless, where will that emerge from? And speak also realistically from the standpoint of the resources required to do that. Because a lot of socialists there are talking about civil society education. That's great. But in order to get something like that funded, one would have to develop a huge degree of alliances with effectively the existing professionals, turn them into class traitors, convince them of this social vision to turn against their interests, right?
Yeah.
That's not easy to do.
No, it's not. I have an idea, which maybe it's a pipe dream. I don't know. But the idea is that we create institutions that we start creating non-monetary spheres of coordination, basically allowing for certain aspects of social reproduction to be done outside of professional labor right now. So you probably might be familiar with like crisis of care type of research, social reproduction crisis. Like a lot of the problems with child care and elder care right now, right?
Sure.
And I think this is also symptomatic of the problems of social atomization that I was talking about earlier. One thing that I think stands in the way of creating formal institutions in the non-monetary sphere of coordination, which can be done through like cybernetic means. You can create apps and software that does planning and accounting for large groups of doing these type of things, of a babysitting cooperative, for example, a elder care thing like that. But the big barrier to that, and I have something I may be presenting at a conference next summer about this, is I think taxes on bartering, which is kind of a niche issue right now, but one that I think is very important to this, because basically the way the state treats barter transactions is the same as monetary transactions. So, which is a problem because barter transactions don't create cash income, but they do create cash liabilities in the form of taxes. So, if you wanted to do a lot of economic activities that were well documented, that were non-monetary exchanges, then you would be opening yourself up to taxation. And if you do it I did some math on it recently, that if you were to do the equivalent of the median American wage in barter, the bottom 29 to 39% of Americans could not afford the taxes on that barter income. So this is a big barrier to actually creating these kinds of institutions in the non-monetary sphere and doing some kind of non-professional coordination to solve these problems. So that's one thing I'm thinking of. The other thing is that what I was just talking about before, of trying to build the civil society, media ecology, trying to pull people together in a way that can convince people on this issue. But I think that if we get rid of barter taxes, or I guess you could take an illegalist route and try to do it anyway with them, but it would be a lot easier without them. If you could do that, you could create a actual material base for non-professional kind of reproduction of society.
Yeah, that's... And the two would have to have an interlinkage, because on the one hand, there would be the resolution to the problem of social atomization through societies and clubs and organizations that help fill in, but the composition of those organizations do not themselves need to be ideological. Mm-hmm. The argument would be that a non-coercive approach to furthering socialist ideology would organically emanate from the mere existence of this social base.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean,
but that is a theory. Like, that's not, you see, because if it were truly to grow, I mean, here I'm almost reminded of like Hard and Negri. Mm-hmm. Insofar as, like, I just interviewed Jacques Rancière, and he said something very interesting, which is that Hard and Negri represent, in some sense, the last attempt on behalf of Marxists to argue, similar to what Marx argued, that the basis of existing bourgeois institutions and groups and civil society organizations, i.e. the multitude, pregnant within them is the means for the dissolution of bourgeois society itself. Like a highly optimistic vision, right? Mm-hmm. But that is not the vision of the neo-Kautsky civil society effort, as far as I see it, right? It can't be, because it would have to institute mm-hmm. some means of differentiation from existing bourgeois civil society groups. Do you agree? And how would you do that?
Right. So I think it is true that we need to, like, bourgeois civil society as it exists right now is not going to produce anything. It's basically, if it's like this forever, we're fucked. So something's got to change. But I think something there is a necessary tendency that we are observing right now in the increase in social atomization, which suggests that something does have to change necessarily as a part of history, because otherwise it cannot continue like this. And that this is a problem specifically for liberal democratic capitalism, especially because
and you're diagnosing this from an empirical standpoint regarding social decay, mental health crises,
Mm-hmm.
mass shootings. This is the evidence by which you're pulling this from, right? This is this
Yeah.
crisis.
Well, I
Okay.
would also say that this is, I mean, there's the fundamental empirical trend of social itemization. Like those are the symptoms, but we can observe it going like directly going back far longer before. I mean, Engels even talked about it in talking about England. So this has been here from the beginning of capitalism, and has continued to grow, accumulate ever since. And it's become much more of an acute problem now, because it's been going on for so long, um, and it's affecting so many things. It's affecting like this crisis of care. It's affecting birth rates. It's affecting random individualistic violence. It's all kinds of insanity. There's this thing that Lacan said, that Althusser said Lacan said, that was he had this research project before World War II about that some people desire to be insane or something like that to that effect. Some people wish to be mad, who aren't mad, and the thing about what ideological state apparatuses do, and Althusser didn't say this, but I kind of put it together, was that they force people that want to be mad to be normal. And when those systems of socialization break down, the badness emerges. And that is what we're seeing all around us today, I think.
Yeah, and also, I mean, that's true, but it's also a fact at the same time that during the welfare state period, you know, and I've tracked a lot of this in my study on the family, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, what you have emerge is certain positive effects of non-assertive marriage, which have huge impacts on helping to mitigate proletarianization on the one hand, have huge impacts on the problem of like training in the workplace, have huge impacts also on leisure, on access to leisure time when you have that cross marriage. But now the trends have really been accelerating such that people get married inside of their own class. And that fact, I maintain, conceals a very pernicious, like deeper form of social anime and and antagonism, which also has somewhat like made marriage and matrimony almost like split from its bourgeois origins. So now we almost have like two forms of matrimony that are almost like class, like highly classed. And I think one of the things I would want to say about the construction of a proletarian civil society effort would be that it still should have, right, the capacity to engage in and challenge um, forms of bourgeois ideology. Do you agree with that? I mean, how else could, because I mean, like, you know, our tradition is a rationalist tradition, right? In some way, we generate our tradition discursively, and we believe in the power of our ideas, right? So, how would you think of intellectuals and the intellectual public sphere in this kind of constellation of new institutions that you're theorizing? Like, especially because of your vision regarding the university, what does the intellectual look like? Maybe is one way to ask that question, if that makes sense to you.
Sure. I mean, the whole idea of the merger formula that the neo-Kafkists are fond of is that is a merger of the socialist intellectuals with the working class is what makes the workers' movement the Social Democratic Party, um, and like I think that for most, like the intellectuals would look a lot more like Marx and people maybe like you and me who are just like on the internet being cranks. uh, but people who are basically on the margins. And I know this isn't the way that Marx necessarily used the word Lumenproletariat, but he defines it oftentimes in opposition to the state, those acting like who are like outside of the official state, like the Society of December 10th is a part of that. All of the like journalists supporting Bonaparte were, and in a sense, Marx was a kind of Lumenproletariat intellectual of the opposites of the journalists who supported Bonaparte. Um, and I think that basically sums up of what intellectuals would look like in like this intermediate period for socialists. Is that basically people on the margins, Lumenproletariat intellectuals?
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, I can get behind that. I mean, first off, I've thought a lot about that. I mean, I think that the intellectual should yeah. First of all, part of the problem of the repressive, scratch that, control based effects of the liberal intelligentsia in our time is that not only are they like sensorial, but I would argue that there's an instrumentalization of thought control, which itself is furthered along in bourgeois institutions in our time in a weird paradoxical way, precisely insofar as like there is no center to their, like, this idea of the realization of the bourgeois state is like peeling an onion, and you peel the onion and you realize that there's no substance at its core. Like that's what Marx realizes about the state, is that it's like a substanceless core composed of external social relations which determine that empty core ultimately. And so as such, I think that a socialist project would have to have a substantial core. And I think when you do have a substantial core, you get into a mimetic rivalry with bourgeois intellectuals, precisely. And this is sort of like the kernel of what keeps them busy, right? So what I would worry about is that if you define the Marxist intellectual as lumpen, you're actually doing a disservice to the Marxist intellectual, who themselves are far more serious in their interdisciplinary interest and curiosity than the existing bourgeois specialized intellectual, because their specialization is a means to control the distribution of what is valid and what is valorizable of intellectual life. And that's the gatekeeping function that they play. So also that Marx as a thinker is far more dignified in a certain way, and is far more knowledgeable, as you know, of course, of bourgeois knowledge and its traditions and all of that. And I think we should be as well. And also, like, yeah, if you really do want to contest bourgeois intellectuals, you need to have a minimal degree of respect from them. I mean, they should still see you as a marginal outlaw, but they shouldn't see you as a joke or something like that. So
for sure.
Right? But that's a fine line to dance, and I think that it's the classic Socratic thing. It's like that is frankly what philosophy is, as I understand philosophy. Philosophy is defined by Socrates in that adversarial relationship to the state, right? So, I mean, I'm agreeing with you. I'm kind of building on what you're saying, but I do agree with you. I just don't know if lumpen is the right term, because
it's very loaded. I know. I'm using it in kind of a quirky kind of way.
Well, people have a very economistic theory of lumpen, and frankly, people are terrified, I think maybe rightly so, of lumpen because of maybe how common it is. I mean, like Derek Varney and I talk a lot about how lumpenized the working class is, and how that lumpenization, and this is a project of education, right? I think is not they're not really often capable of fully absorbing the fact that they're lumpen. So it's like psychoanalytically disavowed, frankly.
Right.
So, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think that we want to be careful because you're using it almost like metaphorically, whereas most people think about it economistically. You're not really thinking about it economistically.
Right. Well, I mean, kind of, sort of. I mean, what Marx says economistically about it, in at least his writings on France, is just that there are people reliant on either donations or financial kind of chickeniggery, like kind of nonsense, uh, all kinds of like marginal economic activities, basically. Um, and I think that kind of applies, at least to most people who are like intellectuals on the internet who rely on like a Patreon or what have you. But I think going back to your point earlier,
Well, maybe, but how familiar are you with academics? Because the chicanery of academics is far worse. And I'll tell you why it's worse. Because it has no constituency. It has no constituency, A. And B, its internal culture is far more internally antagonistic. And as a result, most academics today have a profound motivation crisis. They're not productive. So I think that you're allowing yourself to define the terms based on the bourgeois academic. How that's exactly how they would want to define the terms. I think we should be a little bit more critical. I would be far more critical of them. I don't have the same trust of their productivity, of their legitimacy. I don't have the same trust of their brilliance. I don't see it at all.
No, this isn't to like say that this isn't to provide them legitimacy or anything. It's just to place them within like the official sphere of like the state and its legitimacy producing operations. That's all I'm getting at. And related to that, Althusser has this kind of phrase that he has in Lenin and Philosophy, where he says that philosophy is class struggle in theory, which I think is quite a nice line. That basically militants, party militants, should know all the philosophy stuff because they will be confronted with it from the bourgeoisie, from the bourgeois intellectuals, and if they aren't prepared to know how to deal with it, then it's to their disadvantage. That every militant has to know how to think independently and critically, and that is essential to this whole operation.
Yes, I think that's really solid. I mean, I think this is another domain of conversation and maybe disagreement, but obviously comradely and healthy disagreement we may or may not have. Regarding the legacy of Althusser, I have come to see the legacy of Althusser as kind of steering Marxism towards a very theoretically rich, but also perhaps overly theoretical horizon of its self-constitution. I mean, he declares that Marxism is in a fundamental crisis, and he seems to provide philosophy and theory as the means to resolve that crisis, which itself makes Althusser like a, you could say sort of grants permission to Marxism to remain within the academy. So, I mean, I think that, the problem, as Russell Jacoby, you saw maybe his recent op-ed in Jacobin, of the problem of American Marxism is that it's too academic. I think immediately of Althusser. Maybe that wasn't exactly his fault, but one of the things biographically about Althusser, right, is the fact that he was situated at the 68 moment where many of the students that revolted in 68 were advocating a break from the working class as the agent of revolution, centering students, but also going against thinkers like Althusser as too doctrinaire or too orthodox in their Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
And Althusser subsequently, after 68, and I want your take on this, kind of revises a lot of his thought. And I think perhaps in some ways for the worse. Although I know that, like, when you get to some of his later work on social reproduction, that collection of essays, he sounds very much like almost like a party apparatchik. So there's a lot of inconsistency in his work. But I wonder how you think of the legacy of Althusser.
So
what are the good sides? What are the bad sides? Maybe.
Sure. I think I would disagree with that characterization of his arc over time, because if you look at like the very early work, it was all like you have Reading Capital and For Marx, and he's very much into the heavy theory of Marx, of all these very philosophical disputes. As all of his, that's where it's like his most important work on materialism, I think, is. I think if you look at what he writes after 68, it's all his most important stuff on the theory of the state, in my opinion. And even his very late stuff, I think, is very, very good philosophy, very good theoretical work. So, I mean, I enjoy the materialism.
No, you're right. The ideological state apparatus essay comes out right after 68, and I
believe it's 71 that he comes out.
Yeah. And a lot of that is you trying to sort of incorporate the lessons of 68 into a new theory of the state itself. So, I mean, I agree with you. But I'm also reading Althusser through the legacy of like his main expositors like Leclau and so like the Althusserian school of like Balibar. Rancière obviously strongly breaks from Althusser, and even Alain Badiou, and all of those figures go on to, what do they go on to do? They go on to found various trends of what's called post-Marxism. So Althusser ushers in a novelty of theoretical invention within Marxist thought. There's almost like seemingly no limits, right? And lo and behold, most of his prize students go on to like fundamentally redefine Marxist core kind of categories. And I'm not necessarily deriding them for that. They're my mentors. That's where I cut my teeth. I went and studied with these figures. And they're highly precocious and highly creative. But the effect that they've had on young people's understanding of Marxism has been largely, and I want your take on this too, as I experience it firsthand, has largely been, because keep in mind, as Isabel Garro says, one of the best critics of Althusser and his legacy, the Marxism of Foucault and Deleuze was Althusserian. So one final point. I know this is going to bother you. I'm sorry, but let me just one final point. Okay, as a result of that, a lot of people come to Marxism and they think that it is like a sort of free-for-all petri dish of theoretical experimentation where anything goes. Okay, what I'm saying to you is that it's been a maybe unintended effect of Althusser centering theory in the way that he centers it. I'll stop there.
So I think that in many ways, Althusser is a victim of circumstance in this respect. I agree with you that that's what ended up happening. With all of the post-structuralist thinkers, all of Althusser's students kind of took things for a turn for the worst. But I think that what you have to understand about what Althusser was trying to do was specifically in the context of the French Communist Party. And which he stayed in until it was no longer good for the party for him to stay in. And he his theoretical interventions were his means of intervening in the politics of the French Communist Party, and he wished that those radical students had been in the party to sway it left in the crucial moments where it mattered in the May '68 moment, but they weren't. And I think he was right to say that there was still this important connection to the working class that the Communist Party had, that people didn't really miss until it was gone. And what ended up happening is that they took the kind of this, they saw that this type of critique he was doing, but the critique only made sense, was only legible within the certain orthodoxy. By trying to embracing total heterodoxy of not having the orthodoxy of the party to have that meaning against, it lost all of that deeper meaning to it. And that's basically what ended up happening with all of the students who didn't have that connection, and were basically just constantly generating this this discourse that could mean. And Deleuze says this explicitly of how much he hated orthodoxy because of the way it affected meaning or something, but specifically that by basically creating a movement against orthodoxy itself, of having nothing to serve that purpose, there was much less that could be said that they were able to say.
No, that's very helpful. I suppose, first of all, I mean, there's so much with Althusser, and he's one of these figures that is essential to engage and to read. And I think, like most thinkers, you are and you are not responsible for the children that you give birth to, right? I mean, that's sort of like a general warning to any thinker. Pay attention to how your disciples speak about your work. And, but I mean, I think there's many other points in the Althusserian system that perhaps we could talk about on another occasion. For example, the core idea of the epistemological break in the early Marx, is something that I struggle with, but I struggle with it not because I necessarily disagree with him regarding it as a philological or textual claim. No, I see the logic of the epistemological difference regarding the Marx of the 1844 manuscripts and sort of the Marx after he discovers what fetishism actually implies, right? Which is kind of what it is about. What are the true consequences of seeing capitalism as a proletarian once you have a sophisticated idea of commodity fetishism, right? That's kind of like the epistemological break. Now, the problem that I have with that is that you lose out on certain radical forms of humanism in some instances, and it becomes a kind of barrier, I would argue, or could become a barrier for a fuller and for a richer form of radical praxis. So I've thought about that. But I mean, so much of Althusser is extremely brilliant. I have also written quite a lot about the downsides, and I'll send you my work on this.
Appreciate it.
Well, no, I haven't mentioned it, but of Althusser's Embrace of Lacan. I'm a huge reader of Lacan, okay, but because I was reading the letters of the two, and what I realized was that Althusser is breaking from Marx's theory of alienation in a certain way, but he's doing that through an embrace of Lacan. Through an embrace of Lacan's idea of the subject, of the human, and of the ego, of the imaginary. Okay, and anyways, I have some issues with it because it forces us to miss the granularity of alienation. In short,
Okay.
huge topic. It's very theory heavy, but
Mhm.
we could discuss it at another point. But
Sure.
no, but I mean, I think your work on Althusser and the state is really solid and very sort of interesting. I mean, I really gained a lot from your reference to Samuel Huntington on the state. I'm on professionals. I'm going to go research that. What do you think, maybe as a final question, of contemporary hot debates on the PMC question in light of everything we've talked about? Is there any points at which you might, because I feel like what you've mentioned tonight gives me a different way to even like conceive of the PMC. First of all, not a class, so they are PM, they are professional managers, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But how do you, and have you written like specifically on the Catherine Liu? I mean, I think like in practice, I align with Catherine. I definitely align with Catherine in terms of like affect in my because I live with the PMC, and so I know, like when I snapped at you a moment ago for suggesting that proletarian intellectuals are illegitimate or something, like no, I have to reject that on principle because I know how illegitimate the PMC are, how fake the legitimacy is and undeserved. So I connect with Catherine at that level, but I also can't connect with Catherine too much on that because it's so fire and brimstone. It's so, it's pure negation, right? In some sense. And, you can have comradely love for her at that level, but there's also like no solidarity possible in some ways with Catherine's approach to the PMC.
I can send you some of the articles and polemics I've written about it, because that was a very hot button issue a few years ago, and I
think it still is.
It still is. It's still going on. Nothing ever ends, I guess. But basically, I think that my position may have evolved a little bit since I've written on it. But I basically, because I am focusing more on that they have a specific ideology, but it's not like I think I am very strictly orthodox about that. You really need to have a specific type of income associated with you to have a class, and that's not really. It's just a kind of a hodgepodge.
But wait, why do you say income? Because
you need a specific type of laws that dictate your income in order to differentiate you as a class. So like wages versus profits and that sort of thing.
So then why then? Okay, so then the professionals are not a class precisely because they have a unique function granted by the state to further an interest, which is itself not of a particular class on the one hand. On the other hand, are you saying that, yeah, in another valence or another perspective, they are a classed subject, but there's inner gradients of their class?
Yeah, I think that you could assign that some of them are just bourgeoisie, some of them are petty bourgeois, some of them are proletariat. They're just a hodgepodge of different classes that are unified by a specific ideology through liberal education.
Got it. I see. Okay, that makes sense. So your polemic on the PMC would then be what? Like,
well, I think that
because Gabriel Winant, right, is leading the legacy of Barbara Ehrenreich, which is, well, no. The PMC should be nurtured. They're noble. They're egalitarian. They're for justice. Da 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 da. My view is that actually beneath the PMC is a far more pernicious beast, and that those values, so-called, even though I don't like this category of values, let's just say it, like the Weberian idea, is like over determined by bourgeois ideology. So that's actually where I would side with Catherine. Strategically, I can't follow her all the way because I don't see any solidarity formable other than with the populist right after she's done with her critique of them.
So I've gone back and forth, I guess, about like what's the strategy there. I'm not really sure, because I mean, obviously there's lots of these downwardly mobile that are present in like DSA and so on. In terms of like if they thought of them, if they actually became a real class, I think that if we might actually have more of a discussion that they could play a historically progressive role. The fact that they're not means that they're always just going to have this specific functioning within capitalist society of keeping the state running as it is. I think they kind of came close to becoming a class in the Soviet Union, but kind of just dissolved back into the capitalist class as it ended.
Well, it's a lot more fluid, and I've noticed that I think a lot of them may enter into and further a general sphere of PMC interest for a time being, but then find a career and exit, right? So, but it's still very hard to pinpoint a concentrated basis of their interest, precisely because I don't even think that the interest, quote unquote, of furthering the bourgeois state is premised on a logic of consensus, right? That's one of the naive ideas of the PMC critique. You see my point?
Yeah.
Like this is a lesson of Jacques Rancière. Bourgeois power and bourgeois ideology actually thrives, especially these days, off of dissensus, internal antagonism, and internal chaos, right? And sort of, so, there maybe probably was a time in which the bourgeois state needed a consensus model whereby professionals could function like that. I mean, I think actually the funny thing is socialist professionals would have to operate more on the consensus model. And I think we would, right? And we insist that upon ourselves. And they did. Yeah.
And still do in China, basically. And
right.
Vietnam. So there's two things there. One is that you're absolutely correct. And I think Poulantzas talks about this as well, the overcoding of the state and what have you. And the professionals make that happen. They are what allows everybody to see different ideologies realized within the state. But two, and just to go back to the PMC critics, I think what they're doing, I have a critique of them, is that by saying that every type of ideological position in society necessarily has to have a class associated with it, that's not a road you really want to go down. That is doing a lot of violence to Marx's analysis, basically, Marx's framework. And if you do that, then it no longer has the same explanatory power. I make a specific critique of it in one of those articles, flesh it out a bit more. It's been a while since I've talked about this, but I just don't think it's rigorous to do it like that.
I see what you mean. Yeah, it's a vulgar theory of bourgeois ideology. That PMC, that there's a transitive relationship between inhabiting a PMC job and, because exactly, that's another downside, which is what's the theory of the outlaw PMC who turns against that project? So, I guess it's flawed on those two levels, right? It presupposes that bourgeois ideological power requires consensus amongst PMC. It does not.
Mm-hmm.
And two, it doesn't adequately provide an account for subversive class traders within the PMC who would reject, because most PMC may inhabit a PMC occupation, but themselves have no compelling connection to its ideological project.
I mean, even more than that, like there's that aspect to it, but it also means that people can bracket out basically all of the operations, ideological operations of the state. So you don't need to think about like how this is being done to allow the system to function, which is so it leaves your theory of the state extremely undeveloped if you're just assuming that all this is coming from specific class interests.
No, you've really helped me think that the professional A is not a class, and that B, their function is actually, well, in effect, it must be to preserve bourgeois interests, but they also see themselves as a reining in of the predominance of any one class. So they see themselves as a neutralizer or stabilizer of class conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they often fail in that mission.
Yeah, I mean, they're increasingly failing because of the social atomization, as I talked about earlier, and there's little they can do to stop that. Because honestly, because basically, what professionals are now is a kind of scar tissue. That as a civil society, as like natural, unprofessional civil society has disappeared, they've come to fill it in, and they are one like they have that like there's their own certain pathology. They have this like inability to connect with people because of the atomization, and they're also very expensive. So even like the social reproduction roles, which are now being filled totally by professionals of child care and elder care, like that has caused the cost of those things to skyrocket because now they're all being done by professionals who require education. And that means that like only the most like upper class can afford it to begin with.
Yeah, no, this is elite overproduction is a part of that, and it's interesting though that like that still nonetheless, even though a lot of proletarians have access to elite education, even I was interviewing a PhD from Gaza, right? And that in Gaza you have the highest, I think, average of higher education completion anywhere else in the Middle East.
Wow.
So yeah, there's something something that you've hit on that's very, very correct regarding the sticky problem of the, because you said it kind of as a passing point about the necessary overcoming of the university, but maybe that would be something I'd like to see fleshed out more in future conversations and even in your work. Yeah, I mean, that would be extremely, extremely interesting and essential. But anyways, this has been a very delightful chance to meet you and to hear your thoughts and your theories. I certainly learned a lot in this. Can you tell listeners like how to find your work, but also like what your current research is driving you towards these days?
Sure. So you can find my work on Substack. It's called the philosophy of. I'm sorry, it's the prehistory of an encounter. Is the name of the blog. After the philosophy of the encounter is a reference to that.
It's a reference to Althusser, of course.
Yes, which I will say, like that was the first book, philosophy book, that was like, wow, this is genius. I agree with like almost 100% of what's in it. Incredible book. Cannot recommend it enough. I also write for Cosmonaut occasionally. As you mentioned, I write for Palladium occasionally. I haven't put anything out recently with them, though. You can follow me on Blue Sky as Nico Encounter. And right now I'm working on that barter stuff that I mentioned. I'm just generally thinking about theory of the state stuff of like some of like Fukuyama's kind of like critique of Fukuyama a bit. And I want to eventually write something more long form about theory of the state from this Althusserian perspective. And hopefully I'll put that together at some point.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed it. And I think we have so many overlapping points of interest, in your political premonitions and insights are into professionals are extremely robust and unique. I very much find them very unique.
Thank you.
The fact you incorporate Althusser makes it even better. Yeah, despite my criticisms, which themselves are very particular, but whatever. And yeah, and I guess, aside from you, I mean, Blue Sky, I mean, come on, Blue Sky is like this. Talk about liberal, man. Come on.
I know. It is very annoying scrolling my timeline, the amount of radical liberalism I'm exposed to. I just tweeted about it today, about how much it enrages me, but I'm still optimistic about it for the future.
You like it because of its infrastructural privacy, like
yes, and also, well, not privacy, just like what the infrastructure could make possible, but also I enjoy the feeling of rage.
Oh, interesting. Oh, wow, that's fascinating. Maybe I should head over there. That might be good. Yeah. Anyways, all the best, my friend and comrade. Thanks for coming on, and let's hopefully do this again.
Yep, sounds good.
Take care, everyone.